Welcome to Echo Dreams. Tonight, we're stepping into shadows most people only dare glimpse in nightmares. We're exploring the minds of men who walked among us, smiled at their neighbors, shook hands with politicians, entertained children at birthday parties, all while harboring secrets that would horrify the world. These are stories of manipulation, violence, and the dark psychology that turned ordinary men into monsters. Before we begin this journey into America's most chilling criminal minds, if you find comfort in these stories as you drift off to sleep tonight, please remember to like and subscribe tomorrow when you wake, and comment below to let us know where you are listening from. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's descend into the darkness together. The story of American crime cannot be told without understanding how violence becomes woven into the fabric of a society. And there is perhaps no better place to start than with a boy who arrived from Italy with his family in 1893, landing at the port in what would become modern-day Croatia, before making their way to the promise of America. His name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone, and the world would come to know him as Al Capone. Brooklyn, New York, in the late 19th century was a place of possibility and desperation in equal measure. The Capone family settled at 95 Navy Street in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, joining the thousands of Italian immigrants seeking their fortune in the New World. Gabriel Capone was a barber. Teresa Capone was a seamstress. They were hard-working people, trying to build a life for their children in a city that didn't always welcome them with open arms. Alphonse was born on the 17th of January, 1899, the fourth of 9 children. The family would later move to 38 Garfield Place in Park Slope when young Al was 11 years old. And it was this neighborhood that would shape the trajectory of his entire life. The streets of Brooklyn were different then. Prejudice against Italian immigrants ran deep. Children of immigrants were looked down upon, mocked for their accents, their customs, their poverty. The American dream was preached from every corner, but for young Alphonse Capone, the path to that dream was anything but clear. School was a battleground. Teachers at the strict parochial Catholic school were intolerant of immigrant children, often using physical discipline as a means of control. Young Al showed promise as a student initially, but he had a problem with authority that would define his entire life. By the 6th grade, at age 14, that problem came to a head. After an altercation where he struck a female teacher in the face, Al was expelled. He never returned to formal education again, but education came in many forms on the streets of Brooklyn. Young Alphonse worked odd jobs, candy stores, bowling alleys, anything to bring in money. And it was during this time that he joined his first gangs, the Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors. These weren't sophisticated criminal enterprises. They were bands of young men engaging in petty crime, vandalism, small thefts. But they were also proving grounds, places where a young man could learn the codes of the street, the importance of loyalty, the uses of violence. The pivotal moment in Capone's early life came when he went to work at a place called the Harvard Inn, a bar in Coney Island. The name was a joke. An Italian gangster named Francesco Iole, better known as Frankie Yale, thought it was funny to name his rough establishment after an Ivy League school. There was nothing academic about the Harvard Inn. It was a place of vice and violence, and it was there that young Al Capone began his real education. Frankie Yale saw something in the young man. Capone was tough, unafraid of confrontation, and he had a certain presence even as a teenager. Yale put him to work as a bartender and bouncer. And it was here, in this den of criminal activity, that Capone met the man who would become his lifelong mentor, Johnny Torrio, a gentleman gangster with connections throughout the underworld. But it was also at the Harvard Inn where Capone received the mark that would define his public image. One night, while working the door, Capone made an ill-advised comment to a young woman named Lena Galluccio. Her brother, Frank Galluccio, demanded an apology. When Capone refused, the drunken Frank pulled out a knife and slashed Capone's face 3 times on the left side. The wounds were deep, permanent. They gave Capone the nickname he would despise for the rest of his life. Scarface? Capone would later claim the scars came from fighting in France during World War I, a lie he maintained whenever possible. He hated the nickname Scarface so much that it is said he killed at least one man for using it. But the scars were there, a permanent reminder of a moment of youthful arrogance that nearly cost him his life. In December of 1918, at age 19, Capone married Mae Josephine Coughlin at St. Mary Star of the Sea Church in the Carroll Gardens section of Brooklyn. They had a son, Albert Francis, nicknamed Sonny. Suddenly, Al Capone wasn't just a young tough trying to make his way. He was a husband and father, with mouths to feed and a future to secure. Money became more important than ever. The box factory where he worked wasn't going to provide the life he wanted for his family. And then came the opportunity that would change everything. In 1919, the United States government approved the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, Prohibition, outlawing the manufacture, sale, and transport of liquor. This was a moral victory. To men like Al Capone, it was an invitation to fortune. That same year, Capone fled Brooklyn for Chicago, ostensibly to avoid a murder charge. His mentor, Johnny Torrio, had gone to Chicago to work for crime boss James, Big Jim Colosimo, and he sent for his young protégé. At 20 years old, Al Capone arrived in Chicago with his wife and infant son, leaving behind the streets of Brooklyn, but carrying with him everything he'd learned there. The violence, the loyalty, the understanding that in America, the quickest path to wealth and power ran outside the law. Chicago in 1919 was a city transforming. The Great Migration had brought thousands of African Americans north, seeking escape from Jim Crow South. European immigrants continued to pour in. The city was growing, expanding, bursting with energy and opportunity. And with Prohibition, it was about to become the epicenter of organized crime in America. Johnny Torrio put Capone to work immediately, recognizing his talent for organization and his willingness to use violence when necessary. When Big Jim Colosimo was murdered in 1920, many suspected Torrio had ordered the hit, though nothing was ever proved. What was certain was that Torrio took over Colosimo's empire and brought Capone up with him. Under Torrio's guidance, Capone learned the business side of crime. This wasn't just about breaking skulls and shaking down shopkeepers. This was about building an empire, about controlling territories, about bribing politicians and police officers, about creating a business structure that could survive and thrive. Capone proved to be a natural. He was promoted to running the Four Deuces bar and given responsibility for much of the city's alcohol and prostitution rackets. But Chicago was a violent city, and the competition for control of illegal liquor was fierce. Different gangs controlled different territories, and they protected those territories with savage determination. The North Side Gang, led by Dion O'Banion, and later by George Bugs Moran, was in constant conflict with Torrio and Capone's South Side operation. In 1924, Torrio and Capone enlisted Frankie Yale and other associates to murder O'Banion in his flower shop. It was a brazen killing in broad daylight. O'Banion's associates, Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran, retaliated by attempting to kill Torrio in early 1925. The attack left Torrio badly injured, and after recovering, he made a decision that would reshape Chicago's underworld. He retired to Italy, leaving his entire operation to Al Capone. At age 26, Al Capone became the crime czar of Chicago. He controlled gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging throughout the city. His organization employed hundreds of people. His income ran into millions of dollars, and he did it all while maintaining the public image of a businessman, claiming he was simply giving the people what they want. Capone established himself in Cicero, Illinois, using bribery and widespread intimidation to essentially take over the town council. He made Cicero his fortress, a place where the North Side Gang couldn't easily reach him. He drove in an armored car. He surrounded himself with bodyguards. He was always on guard, always watching, because he knew that in his world, death could come at any moment. The violence of the era was staggering. In 1924, authorities counted 16 gang-related murders in Chicago. By 1929, that number had risen to 64 in a single year. Machine guns had become the weapon of choice, Tommy guns that could cut down multiple men in seconds. The streets ran red with blood as different gangs fought for territory and dominance. But Capone was different from many of his contemporaries in one crucial way. He understood public relations. He opened soup kitchens during the Depression, feeding the hungry when the government seemed unable or unwilling to help. He sponsored a program to provide milk to Chicago school children to fight rickets. He sent elaborate floral arrangements to the funerals of men he'd killed, a gesture of respect even to his enemies. The public loved him. They saw him at ball games and cheered for him while they booed President Herbert Hoover. Of course, beneath the charm and the charitable works was a man of extraordinary violence. Capone was personally involved in murders, though he tried to distance himself from the actual killings whenever possible. He would plan the operations, give the orders, and let his men carry out the executions. But he wasn't squeamish about violence. In one notorious incident, Capone invited two men who'd betrayed him, Albert Anselmi and John Scalise, to a dinner in their honor. During the meal, while giving a speech praising their loyalty, Capone suddenly produced an Indian club and beat both men to death in front of the assembled guests. The event that would come to define Capone's reign and ultimately contribute to his downfall occurred on Valentine's Day, 1929. It was a cold February morning in Chicago. At a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, 7 men waited for a meeting that would never happen. They were members of Bugs Moran's North Side gang, and they'd been told about a truck of hijacked whiskey available at a good price. Around 10:30 in the morning, a Cadillac that looked like a police car pulled up outside. 4 men got out, 2 of them dressed in police uniforms. The North Side gangsters thought it was a routine police raid. They weren't too concerned. Police raids happened all the time, and they could usually be handled with a bribe or a phone call to a friendly politician. The men in police uniforms ordered Moran's gang members to line up against the wall. Hands up. The gangsters complied. And then the 2 men in civilian clothes produced Thompson submachine guns and opened fire. 70 rounds of ammunition tore through the 7 men lined against the garage wall. When it was over, 6 were dead instantly. The 7th, Frank Gusenberg, was still barely alive when police arrived. He'd been hit 22 times. Even as he lay dying, Gusenberg refused to talk. When pressed to say what happened, he repeated the code of the street: "Nobody shot me." He died a few hours later. The only witness to the massacre was a dog named Highball, tied up in the garage. The dog howled so frantically during and after the shooting that neighbors called the police. The dog was never the same afterward, and eventually had to be put down by authorities. The trauma had broken something fundamental in the animal's mind. Bugs Moran himself narrowly escaped death that day. He was running late to the meeting and, seeing what he thought was a police car outside, kept walking. Had he been on time, the death toll would have been 10 instead of 7. The St. Valentine's Day massacre horrified the nation. Up until that point, many Americans had viewed gangsters, like Capone, as romantic figures. Modern-day Robin Hoods who defied unjust laws and threw lavish parties. But the sheer brutality of the massacre, the cold-blooded execution of 7 men, changed public perception. This wasn't romantic. This was terrorism. Capone, of course, denied any involvement. He was at his home in Florida at the time, he claimed, and had nothing to do with the murders. When reporters asked him about it, his response was telling: "The only man who kills like that is Bugs Moran." It was a peculiar statement from a man claiming innocence. The investigation into the massacre dragged on. Police detained several suspects, including Jack McGurn, one of Capone's top enforcers. McGurn's girlfriend, Louise Rolfe, provided him with an alibi, claiming they were together at the time of the murders. The alibi was so perfectly constructed that it became known as the Blonde Alibi. Charges against McGurn were eventually dropped. The break in the case came months later and hundreds of miles away. In December 1929, a man named Fred Burke, drunk, crashed into another car in St. Joseph, Michigan. When police officer Charles Skelly intervened, Burke shot him 3 times and drove off. Skelly died hours later. Police raided Burke's home and found a treasure trove: $310,000 in recently stolen bonds, 2 Thompson submachine guns with 9 ammunition drums, tear gas bombs, rifles, a sawed-off shotgun, and approximately 5,000 rounds of ammunition. When the weapons were forensically examined, they were identified as the guns used in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. One of them had also been used to murder New York mobster Frankie Yale 18 months earlier. Burke was captured in 1931 and sentenced to life in prison in Michigan for killing Officer Skelly. The case against him for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was stronger in some ways, but Michigan had first claim. Burke never admitted to involvement in the massacre, and the case remains officially unsolved to this day. But everyone knew who had ordered it. Al Capone had sent a message to his rivals, and that message was written in blood. Yet the massacre, meant to consolidate Capone's power, actually marked the beginning of his downfall. The federal government, led by Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt, began investigating Capone in earnest. They couldn't get him on murder charges. Witnesses refused to testify. Evidence disappeared. Police and prosecutors were often on his payroll. But there was one thing Capone couldn't buy his way out of: taxes. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Al Capone lived a lavish lifestyle. He wore custom suits, smoked expensive cigars, ate at the finest restaurants, and threw parties that cost thousands of dollars. All of this wealth came from illegal activities, but that didn't matter under tax law. The Supreme Court had ruled in 1927 that illegally earned income was still subject to income tax. Federal agents led by Eliot Ness and his team of untouchables worked tirelessly to build a case against Capone. They raided his breweries and distilleries, disrupting his income streams. More importantly, they gathered evidence of his spending, proving that he had substantial income that he'd never reported to the IRS. In June 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal income tax evasion. The evidence was overwhelming. The government showed that Capone had failed to file tax returns for years, during which he'd earned millions of dollars. Capone attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but Judge James H. Wilkerson refused to honor it. The trial took place in October 1931. Capone's lawyers argued that he couldn't be prosecuted because the income was from illegal sources. But the Supreme Court ruling was clear: all income, regardless of source, was taxable. After a short deliberation, the jury found Al Capone guilty. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence for tax evasion ever handed down at that time. Capone initially served his time in Atlanta, where he quickly established himself as a powerful figure even behind bars. Worried that he was still running his criminal empire from prison, authorities transferred him in 1934 to a new facility designed to hold America's worst criminals, Alcatraz, the island prison in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz was different. There were no other gang members there. No one to take orders from him, no empire to run. For the first time in years, Al Capone was just another prisoner. He tried to be a model inmate, hoping to earn early release. But something was happening to him. Something that had been happening for years, but was now accelerating. Al Capone had syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease he'd likely contracted years earlier in his youth. Left untreated, syphilis can ravage the brain, causing dementia, personality changes, and physical deterioration. Capone had never sought proper treatment, and now, in his 30s, the disease was destroying his mind. By the time he was paroled in November 1939, having served 7 years and 6 months of his sentence, Al Capone was no longer the sharp, intimidating crime boss who'd once ruled Chicago. He was mentally impaired, barely able to function. He returned to his estate on Palm Island in Florida, where he lived in increasing isolation and confusion. The man who'd once commanded an empire now spent his days fishing in his pool, often not knowing where he was or what year it was. He would tell visitors about people who weren't there, remembering conversations that had never happened. His wife May cared for him as best she could, but there was no reversing the damage. On the 25th of January 1947, Al Capone suffered a stroke. He died shortly after at his home in Florida, at age 48. The man who'd survived countless assassination attempts, who'd built and ruled an empire of crime, who'd become public enemy number one, died not in a hail of bullets, but in confused, senile deterioration. Capone's story tells us something profound about the nature of power and violence in American society. He rose from poverty, using intelligence, ruthlessness, and an understanding of what people wanted to build an empire. But he also reveals the cost of that violence. The bodies piled up. Valentine's Day Massacre shocked a nation, and in the end, it wasn't his crimes that brought him down, but his failure to pay taxes. The Prohibition era ended in 1933 with the 21st Amendment, repealing the 18th. The great experiment in legislating morality had failed, but it had created fortunes for men like Capone and established organized crime as a permanent feature of American life. The structures Capone and others built during Prohibition survived long after the speakeasies closed. And there is something else in Capone's story, something darker that speaks to the psychology of violence. He was capable of extraordinary brutality, yet he also opened soup kitchens and provided milk to children. He could beat men to death with a club at a dinner party, then send flowers to their funerals. This duality, this ability to compartmentalize violence and humanity, would appear again and again in the criminals we're exploring tonight. But Capone was a product of his time and circumstances in many ways. A poor immigrant son who saw crime as a path to success and took it. Our next subject is different. He was a mystery, a cipher, a presence who struck without warning and vanished into the fog. The newspapers called him the Zodiac Killer, and for years he terrorized Northern California, killing without apparent motive and taunting authorities with cryptic letters and codes. The terror began on a cold December night in 1968, the 20th of December, a Friday evening in Benicia, California, a small city in the Bay Area. David Arthur Faraday, 17 years old, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, were on their first date. They drove to a remote spot on Lake Herman Road, a secluded area where young couples went to be alone. Around 11 o'clock, another vehicle pulled up beside David's Rambler station wagon. Someone got out and approached. What happened next was swift and brutal. Betty Lou tried to run. She made it about 30 feet from the car before the killer shot her 5 times in the back with a .22 caliber weapon. David Faraday shot once in the head at point. Blank range as he sat in the car, died almost instantly. A passing motorist discovered the body shortly after 11 and called police. The crime scene offered few clues. Spent shell casings were found near the car. The killer had used a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. But there was no clear motive. Nothing was stolen. There was no evidence of sexual assault. It appeared to be a random act of violence, which made it all the more terrifying. 7 months passed. The murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen went unsolved. Then, on the night of the 4th of July, 1969, Independence Day, the killer struck again. Darlene Elizabeth Farron, age 22, and Michael Renaud Majot, 19, were parked in Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, another secluded spot popular with couples. Around midnight, a car pulled up beside them. Someone got out with a bright flashlight, blinding them. Then came the gunfire. A 9mm semi-automatic pistol fired multiple times. Darlene was hit 9 times. Michael was shot 4 times. The killer left them for dead and drove away. But Michael Majot survived, severely wounded. He managed to describe the attack to police. A man stocky build had approached their car and opened fire without warning. It was clearly the same person who'd killed Faraday and Jensen, police realized. They had a serial killer operating in the Bay Area. Less than an hour after the shooting, the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call from a man claiming responsibility. The caller's voice was calm, almost emotionless. He described the location of the shooting, the type of weapon used, and then he said something chilling. "I also killed those kids last year." The call was brief. The man hung up before police could trace it. But they now knew they were dealing with someone who killed for sport, someone who wanted recognition for his crimes. On the 31st of July, 1969, 3 Bay Area newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald, each received a letter. The letters were nearly identical, written in a neat, precise hand. Each contained a cryptogram, A third of a larger cipher split between the three papers. The letter writer demanded that the newspapers print the ciphers on their front pages. If they didn't, he promised, he would go on a killing spree. The letters were signed not with a name but with a symbol, a circle with a cross through it, like the crosshairs of a gun sight. The writer didn't give himself a name in these first letters, but he made it clear that he was the one who'd killed in Benicia and Vallejo. The newspapers printed the ciphers. Amateur and professional codebreakers worked frantically to solve them. Within days, a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty cracked the code. The message, when decrypted, was chilling. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all the people I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. The message revealed a mind that viewed murder as entertainment, as sport. The killer wasn't driven by rage or revenge. He killed because he enjoyed it. And he believed his victims would serve him in the afterlife. It was a deeply disturbing psychology, mixing grandiosity, sadism, and what appeared to be a twisted mythology of his own creation. On the 4th of August, the killer wrote again to the Chronicle. This time, he gave himself a name. This is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the 2 teenagers, last Christmas at Lake Herman, and the girl on the 4th of July. He demanded the newspapers print his name in letters, threatening more violence if they didn't comply. The Zodiac was now in direct communication with the public, using the newspapers as his megaphone, and he was just getting started. On the 27th of September, 1969, a sunny Saturday afternoon, Brian Calvin Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Ann Shepard, 22, were having a picnic at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. It was a beautiful day, and they'd found a secluded spot on a small island in the lake. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, they noticed a man approaching. He was wearing a strange costume, a black executioner, style hood with clip on sunglasses over the eye holes, and a bib-like cloth on his chest. On the cloth was the Zodiac symbol in white, the circle with the cross through it. The man was holding a gun. He claimed to be an escaped convict who needed their car and money. Brian tried to remain calm, to talk to the man. The Zodiac told them to lie face down. He produced rope and tied them up. Then, without warning, he pulled out a knife. He stabbed Cecilia 10 times and Brian 8 times, plunging the blade again and again into their backs. When he was finished, he walked away calmly. Before leaving, he went to Brian's car and wrote on the door, Vallejo 12 to 20 -68, 7 to 4 -69. The 27th of September -69, 6:30 by knife. He was taking credit for his crimes, memorializing them. Brian Hartnell survived his wounds. Cecilia Ann Shepard died 2 days later in the hospital. The Zodiac had changed his method, using a knife instead of a gun. But the pattern was clear. He targeted young couples in secluded locations. He struck without warning, and he seemed to revel in the terror he caused. The Zodiac sent a letter to the Chronicle describing the Lake Berryessa attack in detail. Details only the killer would know. He included a piece of fabric from the bloody shirt Brian had been wearing. This wasn't just about the killing anymore. This was about the communication, the game the Zodiac was playing with police and the public. On the 11th of October, 1969, just 2 weeks after Lake Berryessa, the Zodiac struck again. And this time he changed his pattern completely. Paul Lee Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver, picked up a fare in San Francisco. The passenger asked to be taken to the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets in the Presidio Heights neighborhood. When the cab stopped, the passenger shot Paul Stein once in the head at point blank range with a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. The killer then did something unusual. He tore a piece of fabric from Paul's blood-stained shirt. He was creating a trophy, evidence that he could include in future letters. 3 witnesses, teenagers looking out a window, saw the killer exit the cab. They called police immediately. Responding officers Donald Fuch and Eric Zelms actually passed the killer on the street moments later. But there was a crucial miscommunication. Dispatch had told them to look for a black male suspect, when in fact the killer was white. The officers drove past him, and the Zodiac escaped into the night. Days later, the Chronicle received another letter. The Zodiac included a piece of Paul Stine's bloody shirt as proof of his involvement. He mocked the police for failing to catch him, describing how they'd driven right past him. He claimed, "School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." The threat against school children caused panic throughout the Bay Area. Police stationed officers on school buses. Parents kept their children home. The Zodiac had succeeded in terrorizing an entire region. Over the next several years, the Zodiac continued to send letters, sometimes including new ciphers, sometimes claiming additional murders. He taunted reporter Paul Avery of the Chronicle, sending him a Halloween card with a threat. By fire, by gun, by knife, by rope. Avery started carrying a pistol and wearing a bulletproof vest. His colleagues wore buttons saying, "I am not Avery." In March 1971, the Zodiac sent a letter claiming 17 victims. In January 1974, after nearly 3 years of silence, he sent another letter claiming 37 murders. But police could only definitively link him to 5 deaths: David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stine. 2 others, Brian Hartnell and Michael Mageau, survived. The question that haunted investigators was, who was the Zodiac? They developed several theories over the years. The leading suspect was Arthur Leigh Allen, a school teacher from Vallejo who was fired in 1968. Allen had been reported to police by a friend who claimed Allen had talked about wanting to kill people and call himself Zodiac years before the murders began. Allen owned weapons similar to those used in the attacks. He wore a watch with the Zodiac symbol on it. Police interviewed Allen multiple times. They searched his home. They took samples of his handwriting and fingerprints, but they could never conclusively link him to the crimes. Allen's fingerprints didn't match those found at the scene of Paul Stine's murder. His handwriting was similar, but not identical to the letters. He had alibis, though they weren't always solid. Allen was arrested and convicted of child molestation in 1974, serving 2 years in prison. He died in 1992, never having been charged with the Zodiac murders. Many investigators remained convinced he was the killer, but they never had enough evidence to prove it. Other suspects emerged over the years. In 2014, a man claimed his father, Earl Van Best Jr., was the Zodiac. In 2021, a group called the Case Breakers claimed a man named Gary Francis Post, who died in 2018, was responsible. But none of these claims have been definitively proven. The Zodiac case remains officially unsolved, one of the most infamous cold cases in American criminal history. What makes it so haunting is not just the violence, but the psychology behind it. The Zodiac killed for pleasure, for the thrill of it. He treated murder as a game, keeping score, taunting those who tried to stop him. His letters reveal a narcissistic personality, someone who needed recognition for his crimes. He wasn't content to kill in obscurity. He wanted the world to know, to fear him, to puzzle over his codes and threats. The ciphers he sent were a way of asserting his intellectual superiority, proving he was smarter than everyone trying to catch him. But there is something else in those letters, something that suggests deep psychological disturbance beyond mere sadism. The Zodiac's claim that his victims would become his slaves in the afterlives speaks to a profound disconnection from reality, or perhaps to a belief system so twisted it justified his actions. He seemed to genuinely believe he was collecting servants for the next world. The randomness of his victim selection is particularly disturbing. These weren't people who'd wronged him. They were strangers, chosen simply because they were vulnerable, because they were there. That kind of killing suggests a complete lack of empathy, an inability to see other humans as anything more than objects or targets. The Zodiac also displayed characteristics of what psychologists call a power control killer. He used bindings, ropes, handcuffs, ways of dominating his victims physically. He chose isolated locations where he had complete control. He took his time at Lake Berryessa, talking to Brian and Cecilia, tying them up, savoring the fear he was creating before he struck. The decision to kill Paul Stine, a cab driver in San Francisco, marked a change. This was in the city, not a remote location. It was quick and efficient. Some speculate this shift meant the Zodiac was becoming more confident, more daring. Others think it might have been a different kind of killing entirely, perhaps motivated by something other than the desire to terrorize couples. And then, after 1974, the letters stopped. There are several possible explanations. Perhaps the Zodiac died or was imprisoned for other crimes. Perhaps he became physically or mentally incapacitated. Or perhaps he simply stopped killing and writing, satisfied with the terror he'd created, content to live anonymously with his secrets. The case has inspired countless books, films, and television shows. David Fincher's 2007 film Zodiac brought renewed attention to the crimes. Internet sleuths continue to work on the unsolved ciphers, analyzing every word of every letter. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally solved the 340 character cipher the Zodiac had sent in November 1969, more than 50 years after it was written. The decoded message read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the television show," which brings up a point about me. "I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner. Because I now have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise. So they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life, his life, will be an easy one in paradise death." The misspelling of paradise as paradise was consistent throughout. The message confirmed what the first cipher had suggested. The Zodiac believed his murders were earning him a paradise in the afterlife. It was a chilling glimpse into a deeply disturbed mind. But even with this breakthrough, the Zodiac's true identity remains a mystery. Somewhere out there, if he is still alive, is a man who killed at least 5 people and terrorized millions more. Or perhaps he is long dead, taking his secrets to the grave. Either way, the Zodiac Killer represents a particular kind of terror. The killer who strikes randomly, who can't be predicted or profiled, who might be anyone anywhere. The cases of Al Capone and the Zodiac Killer show us 2 different faces of criminal violence. Capone was a product of his environment, rising through organized crime during a period when alcohol prohibition created enormous opportunities for those willing to break the law. The Zodiac was something else entirely, a killer who seemed to have no rational motive, who killed for pleasure and recognition. But both cases reveal something about the American fascination with crime. We're drawn to these stories, horrified and intrigued in equal measure. We want to understand what drives someone to kill, what separates the murderer from the rest of us. Are criminals born or made? Is there something fundamentally different in their brains? Or could any of us, under the right or wrong circumstances, commit such acts? Our next subject forces us to confront these questions in the most unsettling way possible. Because Theodore Robert Bundy didn't look like a monster. He was handsome, charming, intelligent. He attended college, he had girlfriends. He worked for a political campaign and at a crisis hotline. He seemed like the all-American boy, but behind that facade was one of the most prolific and disturbing serial killers in American history. Ted Bundy was born on the 24th of November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried, and his father's identity was never confirmed. This was 1946, when being an unwed mother carried enormous social stigma. So the family made a decision that would profoundly affect young Theodore's development. They would raise him believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. The deception was maintained throughout his childhood. Bundy grew up in Philadelphia initially, then moved with his mother and grandparents to Tacoma, Washington. It wasn't until his teenage years that Bundy discovered the truth about his parentage. The betrayal he felt at learning his mother was not his sister, that his entire childhood had been based on a lie, has been cited by many psychologists as a pivotal moment in his psychological development. But there were signs of disturbance even earlier. Bundy's grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was reportedly violent and abusive, with a terrible temper. There are accounts of him swinging neighborhood cats by their tails and throwing them. Young Theodore witnessed this violence, this casual cruelty to animals, behaviors that psychologists now recognize as red flags for developing sociopathy. Bundy himself showed disturbing tendencies at a young age. His aunt once woke up to find 3-year-old Ted placing knives around her while she slept, the blades pointing inward. It was the act of a child, but the imagery is chilling. In Tacoma, Bundy's mother married Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook. Theodore took his stepfather's name, becoming Ted Bundy. By outward appearances, he was a normal child. He attended school, made friends, participated in activities. But even then, there were signs of something wrong. Bundy was described as shy and isolated in his early years. He had a speech impediment and was teased by other children. He felt like an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit in with his peers. But as he grew older, he learned to mask these feelings. He learned to perform normalcy, to be charming, to manipulate others' perceptions of him. In high school and college, Bundy became adept at presenting the image people wanted to see. He was good-looking, articulate, and seemingly confident. He studied psychology at the University of Washington, an ironic choice given what he would become. He worked at a crisis hotline, talking people out of suicide. He worked for the Republican Party, impressing his supervisors with his dedication and intelligence. In 1967, Bundy met Stephanie Brooks, a beautiful young woman from California. He fell deeply in love with her. For Bundy, Stephanie represented everything he wanted: beauty, sophistication, status. But the relationship was troubled. Stephanie saw Bundy as aimless, someone without clear direction or ambition. In 1968, she broke up with him. But rather than moving on, he became obsessed. He dropped out of college briefly, then returned with renewed purpose. He transformed himself, becoming more polished, more ambitious. And all the while he was planning his revenge, not against Stephanie specifically, but against women who resembled her. Bundy's victims had a type: young, attractive women with long dark hair parted in the middle, just like Stephanie Brooks. The psychological connection isn't subtle. Bundy was killing versions of the woman who'd rejected him, over and over again. His first confirmed victim was Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old student who disappeared from her basement apartment in Seattle on the 31st of January, 1974. Her roommates found her bedroom neat, the bed made, but blood stains on the pillow and nightgown. Linda was simply gone. Over the next several months, young women began disappearing from colleges in Washington state. Donna Gail Manson, 19, vanished on the 12th of March, 1974. Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, disappeared the 17th of April. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 21, vanished May 6th. Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared the 1st of June. The disappearances followed a pattern. All the women were college-aged, attractive, with long dark hair. All vanished without a trace, leaving behind belongings, cars, no sign of struggle. It was as if they'd simply stepped out of their lives and never returned. On the 14th of July, 1974, Bundy became bold, audacious in a way that would ultimately lead to his downfall. At Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular recreation area east of Seattle, he approached several young women in broad daylight. He was wearing a cast on his arm, presenting himself as injured and in need of help. His approach was disarming. He introduced himself as Ted and explained he needed help loading a sailboat onto his car. The cast made him seem vulnerable, non-threatening. Several women declined, but Janice Ann Ott, 23, and Denise Marie Naslund, 19, agreed to help. Both women disappeared that day. Witnesses remembered seeing them with a good-looking young man with his arm in a sling, driving a tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Lake Sammamish disappearances were a turning point. Witnesses came forward with descriptions. Police released a composite sketch of Ted with his arm in a cast. But even with these leads, Connecting the dots to Theodore Robert Bundy proved difficult. Bundy was careful. He chose victims who were alone, vulnerable. He used various pretenses, the fake cast, crutches, posing as a police officer. He often stalked his victims for days before approaching them, and once he'd gained their trust enough to get them into his car, he would drive to a secluded location, overpower them, and kill them. The details of Bundy's murders are horrific. He sexually assaulted his victims before killing them, usually by strangulation, but his depravity went even further. Bundy engaged in necrophilia, returning to the corpses days or even weeks after the murders to engage in sexual acts with the decomposing bodies. He applied makeup to the corpses, styled their hair, treating them like dolls. In August 1974, Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to attend law school at the University of Utah. The murders in Washington state stopped, but in Utah, young women began disappearing. The pattern continued, college-aged women with long dark hair, vanishing without a trace. On the 8th of November 1974, Bundy approached Carol Daranch, 18, at a shopping mall in Murray, Utah. He identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department and told her someone had tried to break into her car. When she went with him to check, he attempted to handcuff her and force her into his Volkswagen Beetle. Carol fought back. She managed to escape, jumping from the car and running for help. It was the first time one of Bundy's victims had gotten away and lived to identify him. That same night, Debbie Kent, 17, disappeared from her high school after leaving a play. A small key was found in the parking lot. It would later be identified as fitting the handcuffs Bundy had attempted to use on Carol Daranch. The attacks continued. Women disappeared in Colorado. In January 1975, Karen Campbell vanished from a hotel hallway in Snowmass Village. Her nude body was found a month later. Julie Cunningham disappeared in Vail in March 1975. Denise Oliverson vanished from Grand Junction in April. On the 16th of August 1975, Bundy was pulled over for a traffic violation in Granger, Utah. The officer noticed suspicious items in Bundy's Volkswagen: handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, an ice pick, a crowbar. Bundy claimed they were for work or household projects, but the officer wasn't convinced. Bundy was arrested. Carol Daranch identified Bundy as her attacker. The handcuffs found in his car matched the key found where Debbie Kent had disappeared. Bundy was charged with attempted kidnapping. In March 1976, he was convicted and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. But this was just the beginning. As Bundy sat in jail, evidence was mounting connecting him to the Washington murders. Hair found in his car matched victims. Witnesses identified him. In October 1976, Bundy was charged with the murder of Karen Campbell in Colorado. Bundy, ever confident in his own intelligence, decided to represent himself in his Colorado trial. This gave him access to the law library in less restrictive security. On the 7th of June 1977, during a court hearing in Aspen, Bundy asked to visit the library. Once alone, he jumped from a second-story window and escaped into the mountains. He was captured 6 days later after stealing a car, but Bundy had proven he was willing to take enormous risks, and he wasn't done. On the 30th of December 1977, Bundy escaped again, this time from his cell in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He'd lost weight deliberately, allowing him to squeeze through a small opening in the ceiling. He crawled through the ceiling space, dropped into a jailer's apartment, walked out the front door, and disappeared. This time, Bundy made it much farther. He fled to Tallahassee, Florida, adopting the alias Chris Hagen. For 3 weeks, he lived in obscurity. But the urge to kill, the compulsion that drove him, couldn't be contained. On the 15th of January, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University around 3 o'clock in the morning. In less than 15 minutes, he attacked 4 young women in their beds. Lisa Levy, 20, and Margaret Bowman, 21, were beaten to death. Bundy bit Lisa Levy's buttock and breast, leaving bite marks that would later be crucial evidence. 2 other sorority sisters, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were severely injured but survived. Less than 2 hours later, Bundy attacked Cheryl Thomas in her apartment, just blocks from the sorority house. Cheryl survived but suffered permanent hearing loss and a shattered shoulder. The violence of the Chi Omega attacks was different from Bundy's earlier murders. This was frenzied, almost chaotic, a far cry from the careful planning of his previous crimes. It was as if something had broken in Bundy, as if he'd lost the ability to control the compulsion. On the 9th of February, 1978, Bundy abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school in Lake City, Florida. Her body was found 2 months later in a pig shed. She'd been strangled and sexually assaulted. Kimberly Leach would be Bundy's last victim. On the 15th of February, 1978, Bundy was pulled over in Pensacola for driving a stolen Volkswagen Beetle. When police ran his name, they discovered he was wanted for murder. Bundy tried to fight, but he was overpowered and arrested. The evidence against Bundy was overwhelming. Bite mark analysis, then a new forensic technique, matched the marks on Lisa Levy's body to Bundy's teeth. Witnesses placed him at the Chi Omega house. His credit card receipts tracked his movements across Florida. There was no escaping justice this time. Bundy's trials became media circuses. He represented himself again, cross-examining witnesses, delivering opening statements, playing to the cameras. He was charismatic, confident, seemingly unconcerned about his fate. Women sent him love letters. He received marriage proposals. It was a disturbing testament to his manipulative charm, his ability to present himself as something he wasn't. On the 24th of July, 1979, Bundy was found guilty of the Chi Omega murders. The jury recommended death, and Judge Edward Cowart sentenced him accordingly. In a famous moment, Judge Cowart told Bundy, "Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. It is a tragedy to this court to see such a total waste of humanity. You are a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, but you went the wrong way. Partner." Bundy was also convicted of Kimberly Leach's murder in 1980, receiving another death sentence. He spent the next 9 years on death row at Florida State Prison, filing appeals, giving interviews, anything to delay his execution. In a final attempt to stay alive, Bundy began confessing to murders, providing details to detectives about unsolved cases. He confessed to at least 30 murders, though the actual number is likely much higher. Some investigators believe Bundy killed more than 100 women. The confessions revealed the depth of Bundy's depravity. He described returning to Taylor Mountain, a dumping ground for bodies near Seattle, to engage in sexual acts with the decomposing corpses. He explained how he would decapitate some victims and keep their heads as souvenirs. He talked about his crimes with a detached, clinical tone, as if discussing someone else's actions. Psychologists who evaluated Bundy struggled to understand him. He displayed classic psychopathic traits: superficial charm, grandiosity, lack of empathy, manipulativeness. But he was also highly intelligent, organized, capable of long-term planning. He could compartmentalize his life, killing on weekends while working a normal job during the week, maintaining relationships while fantasizing about murder. Police put Gacy under 24-hour surveillance. They followed him everywhere, making their presence obvious. Gacy became increasingly erratic under the pressure. He couldn't bring any more victims to his house. He couldn't dispose of evidence. The walls were closing in. Police obtained a second search warrant. This time, they brought a team of investigators to search every inch of the property. In the crawl space, one officer noticed the smell immediately. A stench of death so strong it was overpowering. They began digging. What they found was a charnel house, a mass grave unlike anything in American criminal history. Body after body, in various states of decomposition, some reduced to skeletons, others more recently deceased. They were stacked like cordwood, arranged in rows, filling nearly every available space. Gacy was arrested on the 21st of December and taken to the Des Plaines police station. Initially, he continued to deny involvement, but as the bodies kept being discovered, as the numbers climbed from 5 to 10 to 15 to 20, Gacy finally confessed. On the 22nd of December, Gacy provided police with a detailed account of his crimes. He drew a diagram of where the bodies were buried. He named some of his victims, though many remained unidentified. He described his methods of killing, explaining the rope trick, describing how long victims typically struggled before dying. The excavation of Gacy's house continued through the holiday season. Investigators would eventually recover 29 bodies from the crawl space, garage, and backyard. Another 4 were recovered from the Des Plaines River. 33 confirmed victims, making Gacy the most prolific serial killer in American history at that time. The house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue NU was completely dismantled during the search. It was like peeling back layers of a monster's lair. The walls came down. The floors were torn up. The garage was demolished. When the search was finally complete, the house was destroyed entirely. It was too contaminated by death to ever be occupied again. Identifying the victims proved difficult. Many had been in the crawl space for years, reduced to bones. Dental records were used when available, but 8 victims remained unidentified even after extensive efforts. They were buried with simple headstones reading, "We are remembered." Gacy's trial began on the 6th of February, 1980. It was a media circus, one of the most publicized trials in American history. Gacy pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that he suffered from multiple personality disorder, that an alternate personality named Jack had committed the murders. The defense brought in psychiatrists who testified about Gacy's troubled childhood, his abusive father, his conflicted sexuality. They argued that Gacy was deeply mentally ill, unable to control his actions. But the prosecution argued that Gacy knew exactly what he was doing. He'd hidden the bodies. He'd cleaned up crime scenes. He'd lied to police. He'd maintained his business and social life while murdering. These weren't the actions of someone who was insane, but of someone who was evil and calculating. The testimony was harrowing. Survivors described being tortured. Medical examiners detailed the injuries found on victims. One particularly dramatic moment came when prosecutor William Kunkel brought a wooden trapdoor from Gacy's crawl space into the courtroom. As he delivered his closing argument, he dropped photographs of each victim through the trapdoor, one by one, making them disappear just as Gacy had made the victims themselves disappear. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all 33 counts of murder. The next day, they recommended the death penalty. Judge Louis Garippo sentenced Gacy to death. Gacy spent the next 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. He continued to maintain his innocence, claiming others had access to his house and must have buried the bodies. He suggested contractors working on his house had done it. He pointed fingers at everyone but himself. During his time on death row, Gacy took up painting. His artwork became bizarrely collectible, with some pieces selling for thousands of dollars. Many of his paintings featured clowns, including self-portraits as Pogo. It was deeply disturbing imagery, knowing these cheerful clown faces were created by the hands that had strangled 33 young men and boys. On May 10, 1994, after all appeals were exhausted, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet, Illinois. His last words were, "Kiss my ass." Outside the prison, hundreds of people had gathered. When news of the execution was announced, they cheered. There was singing, celebrating. Some had signs reading, "No tears for the clown." It was a cathartic moment for a community that had lived with Gacy's evil for 16 years. But Gacy's execution didn't end the horror for the families of his victims. 8 of the bodies remained unidentified. 8 families somewhere who didn't know what had happened to their sons. The Cook County Sheriff's Office continued working to identify them, using new DNA technology as it became available. In 2011, Sheriff Tom Dart reopened the investigation into the unidentified victims, using DNA samples from potential family members and advances in genetic genealogy. Investigators began making identifications. In 2011, they identified William George Bundy, 19, who disappeared in October 1976. In 2017, they identified Jimmy Hawkinson, 16, who'd called his mother from Chicago in August 1976 saying he'd arrived safely. That was the last time she heard from him. In 2021, they identified Francis Wayne Alexander, who'd gone by Wayne, and had been missing since at least 1976. Gacy rebuilt his life with remarkable speed. He started a construction business, PDM contractors, which stood for painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried in 1972 to Carol Hoff, a divorcee with 2 young daughters. They bought a house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township, a middle-class neighborhood on Chicago's northwest side. Gacy became active in the community again. He joined the local Moose Club and was appointed director of the Polish Constitution Day Parade. He created a clown character named Pogo the Clown and performed at children's birthday parties and charity events. He had his picture taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter at a political event in 1978. He was successful, respected, beloved by his neighbors. No one knew that Gacy had already started killing. His first victim was Timothy McCoy, 16 years old, whom Gacy picked up at the Greyhound bus station in Chicago on the 3rd of January, 1972. Timothy was on his way home to Nebraska and had a layover. Gacy offered him a place to stay for the night, according to Gacy's later confession. When he woke up the next morning, Timothy was standing in his bedroom doorway holding a knife. Gacy claimed he thought he was being attacked, that he wrestled the knife away and stabbed Timothy in self-defense. But Gacy later admitted that as Timothy died, as he listened to the gurgulations and gasping, he experienced an intense orgasm. That is when I realized, Gacy said, that death was the ultimate thrill. Whether the killing of Timothy McCoy was truly self-defense or premeditated murder, it awakened something in Gacy. He buried Timothy's body in the crawl space beneath his house and covered the grave with concrete. And he found that he liked it. The killing, the power, the control. For the next 2 years, Gacy killed sporadically. Then in 1975, his marriage to Carol began deteriorating. She'd noticed strange things. Young men coming and going from the house at all hours. An odd smell coming from the crawl space that Gacy blamed on moisture and broken pipes. Her husband's increasing distance from her emotionally and physically. In March 1976, Carol and Gacy divorced, and with his wife and her daughters gone, Gacy's killing accelerated dramatically. Without the constraint of maintaining a family facade, he began killing regularly, sometimes multiple victims in a single month. Gacy's method was disturbingly efficient. He would cruise Chicago's streets, particularly areas near the Greyhound bus station, looking for young men, runaways, hustlers, anyone who wouldn't be immediately missed. He would offer them a job with PDM contractors, promise them money, offer them a place to stay. Many of his victims were his own employees, young men he'd hired to work construction. Once he got them to his house, Gacy would offer them alcohol or drugs. He would talk about magic tricks, particularly one involving handcuffs. He'd ask the young men to put on the handcuffs to see if they could escape. Once they were restrained, Gacy would inform them, "The trick is, you need the key." What followed was hours of torture and sexual assault. Gacy would rape his victims, sometimes while strangling them with a rope tourniquet he called the rope trick. He would tighten the rope slowly, bringing his victims to the edge of consciousness, then loosen it, then tighten it again. Some victims suffered for an hour or more before finally dying. After the murders, Gacy would keep the bodies in his bed for up to 24 hours before burying them. He would bury most in the crawl space beneath his house, arranging them in neat rows, sometimes placing multiple bodies in a single grave to save space. He poured lime over the bodies to speed decomposition and mask the smell. As the crawl space filled, Gacy began burying bodies in other parts of his property. Under the garage in the backyard, when there was no more room on his property, he started dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River from a bridge off Interstate 55. The smell from the crawl space became increasingly difficult to mask. Neighbors complained about it. Gacy told them it was moisture, broken pipes, problems with the sewage system. He spread concrete and lime in the crawl space. He even had one of his victims, Gregory Godzik, 17, dig trenches in the crawl space, trenches that would later hold bodies, possibly including Gregory's own. Young men continued to disappear. John Bukovich, 18, vanished in July 1975 after arguing with Gacy about unpaid wages. His car was found near his parents' home with the keys in the ignition. John would later be found buried under Gacy's garage, buried deeper than the others, encased in concrete. Families reported their sons missing. Some investigations led to Gacy, as people remembered seeing their loved ones with him. But Gacy was charming, cooperative with police. He had alibis, explanations. He'd say the young men had been working for him but had run away, that he didn't know where they'd gone. Police believed him, after all. He was a successful businessman, a pillar of the community. In 1977 and 1978, Gacy's killing reached a fever pitch. He murdered at least 20 only young men and boys in those 2 years. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 21. Some were runaways, some were hustlers. Some were high school students who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The brutality of the murders is difficult to comprehend. These weren't quick killings. Gacy tortured his victims, keeping them alive for hours, inflicting maximum pain and terror. He would read to them from the Bible while assaulting them. He would tell them this was the last trick. He took pleasure not just in the killing, but in the suffering that preceded it. On the 11th of December, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Piest went missing. He'd been at work at a pharmacy in Des Plaines. His mother was there to pick him up for his birthday celebration, when Robert told her he needed to talk to a contractor about a summer job. He'd be right back, he said. He never returned. Robert's disappearance was different from the others. He was a good kid, an honor student, not a runaway or troubled youth. His mother reported him missing immediately, and investigators quickly learned that the contractor Robert had gone to meet was John Wayne Gacy. Paulus went to Gacy's house on the 13th of December. They questioned him. Gacy was cooperative, charming, but Lieutenant Joseph Kozangsak of the Des Plaines Police Department was suspicious. He obtained a search warrant and searched Gacy's house on the 13th of December. The search turned up troubling items: books on homosexuality, marijuana, driver's licenses and other IDs belonging to other people, pills and syringes, but no sign of Robert Piest. However, investigators learned about Gacy's prior conviction in Iowa for sodomy, something he'd hidden from his neighbors and many associates. Bundy himself blamed pornography for his crimes, claiming in a final interview that exposure to violent sexual images had warped his mind. But most experts dismissed this as another manipulation, an attempt to shift responsibility away from himself. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Bundy enjoyed killing. He found sexual gratification in the domination and destruction of women. He was a sadist who'd learned to hide his nature behind a mask of normalcy. On the 24th of January, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Hundreds of people gathered outside the prison to celebrate, holding signs reading, "Burn, Bundy, burn," and setting off fireworks. It was a grotesque carnival atmosphere, a reflection of the hatred Bundy had inspired. But Bundy's execution didn't end the fascination with his case. Books, films, documentaries continue to be produced about him. The question that haunts us is, how did someone who seemed so normal, so charming, harbor such monstrous desires? What was missing in Bundy's psychology that allowed him to see women as objects to be used and discarded? The answer is complex. Bundy's childhood trauma, the lies about his parentage, the violent environment created by his grandfather, all likely contributed. The rejection by Stephanie Brooks may have triggered something that was already there, a rage against women who represented what he couldn't have. His study of psychology gave him the tools to manipulate and deceive. But ultimately, Bundy was a psychopath, someone born without the capacity for empathy or genuine emotional connection. His charm was learned behavior, a mask he wore to lure victims. Behind it was a void, a complete absence of human feeling. And that void could never be filled, only temporarily satisfied through violence. Bundy's case changed how we think about serial killers. He shattered the stereotype of the disorganized, obviously disturbed murderer. Bundy proved that monsters could look like anyone, could be educated and charming, could blend seamlessly into society. This made him more terrifying than any fictional villain. And if Ted Bundy teaches us anything, it is that appearances can be catastrophically deceiving. The smiling law student was a predator. The crisis counselor was planning murders. The boyfriend was returning to corpses in the woods. The human mind is capable of extraordinary compartmentalization, of maintaining contradictory identities. But Bundy wasn't the only killer to hide monstrous behavior behind a facade of normalcy. Our final subject tonight mastered this deception to an even greater degree. He was a successful businessman, a Democratic Party precinct captain, a beloved entertainer who performed as a clown at children's birthday parties and charity events. His neighbors thought he was wonderful. His employees respected him. No one suspected that beneath his house, in a crawl space most people never knew existed, were the bodies of 29 young men and boys. His name was John Wayne Gacy, and he became known as the Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy was born on the 17th of March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children born to John Wayne Gacy Sr. and Marion Elaine Robinson. His childhood was marked by violence and abuse. His father was a brutal man, an alcoholic who beat his children and wife regularly. Young John was beaten with a belt, sometimes until he lost consciousness. Gacy Sr. was also emotionally abusive, constantly belittling his son, calling him stupid, worthless, effeminate. He compared John unfavorably to his sisters, suggesting the boy wasn't masculine enough. This created in young John a desperate need to prove his father wrong, to prove he was a real man. But there were other issues in Gacy's childhood. He suffered from a heart condition that prevented him from playing sports, which his father saw as further evidence of weakness. He was overweight, which led to bullying from other children, and there were disturbing incidents. When Gacy was around 8 years old, a family friend, a contractor, sexually abused him. Gacy never told anyone, carrying the secret and shame with him. At age 11, Gacy was struck in the head by a swing. The blow caused a blood clot in his brain that went undiagnosed for 5 years, during which he suffered from blackouts and seizures. When the clot was finally discovered and dissolved, the blackouts stopped. But the years of unexplained medical issues had been frightening for young John, adding to his sense that something was wrong with him. Despite these challenges, Gacy worked hard to create a normal life. He became involved in Democratic Party politics, joining the Young Democrats organization. He worked various jobs, eventually becoming a shoe salesman. He was good at it, charming customers, making sales. He was learning the skills that would serve him well later: how to read people, how to make them trust him, how to manipulate. In 1964, Gacy married Marlon Myers, whose father owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises in Iowa. Gacy moved with his wife to Waterloo, Iowa, where he managed one of the restaurants. He threw himself into the work and community involvement. He joined the Jaycees, a civic organization, and quickly rose to become vice president of the local chapter. He was a model citizen, hardworking, community-minded, popular. But beneath this facade, Gacy was struggling with his sexuality and with urges he couldn't control. In 1967, Gacy sexually assaulted a teenage boy, the son of a fellow Jaycee. When the victim reported it, Gacy was arrested and charged with sodomy. Other victims came forward. Gacy was convicted in December 1968 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Gacy's wife divorced him while he was incarcerated. His father, who'd always thought John was worthless, died of cirrhosis before Gacy went to prison, without ever speaking to his son again. Gacy would later claim this was one of his greatest regrets, that he never got to prove himself to his father. In prison, Gacy was a model inmate. He worked as a cook, joined prison organizations, earned an early release. After serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence, Gacy was paroled on the 18th of June, 1970. He returned to Chicago, moving in with his mother. As of today, 5 of Gacy's victims remain unidentified. They are remembered only as numbers: Victim 10, Victim 13, Victim 19. Now identified, Victim 24. Now identified, and Victim 26. Somewhere, their families may still wonder what happened to them, not knowing their loved ones are buried in unmarked graves, one of 33 young men murdered by the Killer Clown. Gacy's case reveals the darkest aspects of human nature. He was a predator who used his position in the community as camouflage. His success as a businessman gave him access to vulnerable young men looking for work. His performances as Pogo the Clown made him seem harmless, even endearing. His political connections gave him a veneer of respectability. But beneath it all was a man consumed by rage, sexual sadism, and a need to dominate and destroy. Psychologists who evaluated Gacy diagnosed him as having antisocial personality disorder. Though he scored high on measures of intelligence, he was organized, methodical, capable of living a double life for years. What drove Gacy to kill? The abuse he suffered as a child surely played a role. His father's constant belittling, the suggestion that he wasn't a real man, created a deep psychological wound. His conflicted sexuality in an era when homosexuality was heavily stigmatized added another layer of self-hatred and confusion. But millions of people suffer abuse and trauma without becoming serial killers. Gacy chose to express his rage and pain through violence against the most vulnerable. He chose to lure young men to their deaths, to torture them, to take pleasure in their suffering. And he chose to hide behind a mask of normalcy, continuing to kill even as neighbors complained about the smell, even as families reported their sons missing. The killer clown represents perhaps the ultimate betrayal of trust. Children trusted him as an entertainer. Young men trusted him as an employer. Neighbors trusted him as a community member. Politicians trusted him as a campaign worker. And all the while, he was using that trust to facilitate murder on a massive scale. As we come to the end of tonight's journey into the darkness, we're left with questions that have no easy answers. What makes someone a killer? Is it nature or nurture? Are psychopaths born or made? Can we identify them before they kill? The four men we've explored tonight, Al Capone, the Zodiac Killer, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy, represent different facets of criminal behavior. Capone was a product of his time and circumstances, rising through organized crime during an era when Prohibition created enormous opportunities for those willing to break the law. The Zodiac was a sadistic narcissist who killed for pleasure and recognition, playing a deadly game with law enforcement. Bundy was a psychopathic predator who used charm and intelligence to lure victims. Gacy was a torturer who hid behind respectability, using his position in the community to access and murder young men. What they all share is a fundamental inability or unwillingness to see their victims as human beings. To Capone, people were resources to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. To the Zodiac, they were targets, game pieces in his twisted entertainment. To Bundy, women were objects of desire and rage, existing only to fulfill or frustrate his needs. To Gacy, young men were playthings, existing only for his pleasure before being discarded like trash. This dehumanization is perhaps the most chilling aspect of these cases. We like to think that most people see others as fellow human beings, deserving of empathy and respect. But these men saw through a different lens entirely, and they weren't alone. Throughout history, individuals with this capacity for violence and lack of empathy have committed unspeakable acts. Understanding these criminals doesn't mean excusing them, but it may help us recognize warning signs, protect potential victims, and create a society where such individuals are identified and stopped before they can cause harm. The study of criminal psychology, forensic science, and investigative techniques has advanced enormously since the eras of these killers. DNA analysis, digital surveillance, improved police coordination, all make it harder for serial killers to operate undetected. But the human capacity for evil remains. There are undoubtedly individuals walking among us right now who share the same psychological traits as Bundy or Gacy, who lack empathy, who fantasize about violence. Most will never act on those impulses. Some might be in prison for other crimes, but others may be planning, waiting, looking for opportunity. This is why these stories matter, not for the gore and shock value, but for what they teach us about human nature, about the signs and patterns of violent behavior, about the importance of listening when someone doesn't come home, when a neighbor's house smells wrong, when that charming person seems a little too perfect. The victims of these criminals deserve to be remembered not just as statistics but as individuals. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were on their first date. Linda Ann Healy was a promising student. Robert Piest was an honor student looking forward to his birthday celebration. Timothy McCoy was just trying to get home to Nebraska. They all had families who loved them, futures that were stolen, potential that was never realized. And there are others we don't even know about. The Zodiac claimed 37 victims, Bundy confessed to 30 but likely killed many more. How many bodies are still undiscovered, buried in forests, or dumped in rivers? How many families still wonder what happened to their loved ones? As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember this. Most people are good. Most people have empathy, compassion, the ability to see others as fellow human beings. The criminals we've discussed tonight are aberrations, outliers on the spectrum of human behavior. They're fascinating precisely because they're unusual. But they're also a reminder to stay vigilant, to trust your instincts, to look out for one another. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If someone seems too good to be true, investigate further. If a loved one disappears, don't let it go unsolved. The darkness is real, but so is the light for every criminal who takes lives. There are investigators who dedicate their careers to catching them, families who never give up searching, communities that come together to protect their most vulnerable members. This has been Echo Dreams. Thank you for joining me on this journey into America's most notorious criminal minds. If these stories helped you fall asleep tonight, please remember to like and subscribe when you wake tomorrow, and comment below to let us know where you are listening from. Sweet dreams. And remember, the monsters in these stories are behind bars or in the ground. You are safe. Rest well.